The leather bit down across Sarah's back for the 100th time, each lash counted aloud by the congregation gathered in Redemption's dusty square. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress, but she no longer cried out. Her voice had died somewhere around 50. "Let this be God's judgment on the barren woman," preached Reverend Caldwell, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Let her bear witness to the wages of failing in her divine purpose." Sarah's knees buckled against the whipping post, her wrists raw from the ropes. 3 months since they'd buried her husband Jonas. 3 months since the church elders had declared her cursed for never bearing him children. The townspeople watched with the cold satisfaction of those who believed suffering purified the soul. From the crowd, a weathered rancher named Thomas Whitmore stood with his 3 children pressed close against his legs. His jaw worked slowly, watching the spectacle with growing unease. His own wife had died in childbirth 2 winters past, leaving him to raise Emma, 8, Samuel, 6, and little Mary, barely 4. He'd seen enough death to know the difference between justice and cruelty. The final lash fell. Sarah collapsed forward, her breathing shallow and ragged. Reverend Caldwell raised his arms to the congregation. "The judgment is complete. Let no man offer succor to one marked by God's displeasure." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained slumped against the post, forgotten. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and flies had already begun to gather around her wounds. Thomas felt his children tugging at his coat, eager to leave this place of suffering. But his boots wouldn't move. He'd heard the whispers about Sarah Mitchell, how she'd married Jonas late, past her prime, how year after year passed without the blessing of children, how some believed she'd made a pact with Darius, Ness itself to remain barren. Thomas had never put stock in such talk, but he'd never spoken against it either. Now, watching her broken form in the dust, he felt something stir in his chest, something between shame and recognition. They were both marked now, in different ways, both carrying burdens that others couldn't see. "Papa?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "Why aren't we leaving?" Thomas looked down at his daughter's upturned face, then back at the woman bleeding in the square. The Reverend and his followers had made their judgment clear. Any man who showed mercy to Sarah Mitchell would face their wrath. But as Thomas watched a drop of her blood darken the dusty ground, he found himself stepping forward instead of away. The children's footsteps echoed behind Thomas as he approached the whipping post. Sarah's head hung limp, dark hair matted with sweat and dirt. Up close, he could see the terrible precision of the wounds, each one calculated to hurt without killing. "Mrs. Mitchell," his voice was barely above a whisper. She lifted her head slowly, squinting against the sun. Her eyes, once bright with the hope of new love, now held the hollow look of someone who had been cast out from humanity itself. She tried to speak, but only managed a broken rasp. Thomas glanced around the square. Most of the congregation had returned to their daily affairs, satisfied that righteousness had been served. But he caught sight of Reverend Caldwell watching from the church steps, his pale eyes fixed on Thomas with keen attention. "Papa, what are you doing?" Samuel's voice carried more confusion than fear. Thomas knelt beside Sarah, his hands hovering uncertainly over her bonds. The rope had cut deep into her wrists. Blood had dried in dark streams down her arms. Every instinct told him to help her, but every lesson of survival in this harsh land warned him against it. "The Reverend said," Emma began, then stopped herself. "I know what he said." Thomas's voice was tight. He'd built his ranch through 15 years of hard work, earned respect through quiet strength and fair dealing. His children had a place here, friends, a future. All of that could vanish with one act of defiance against the church's judgment. Sarah's eyes found his, and in them he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not pleading, she was past that, just a quiet recognition of shared loneliness, of understanding what it meant to be marked by loss. Behind him, little Mary began to cry. "She's hurt, Papa. Why is she hurt?" Thomas closed his eyes. In the past 2 years, he'd taught his children that the world was often cruel, but that cruelty didn't have to define them. He'd shown them how to be strong without being hard, how to survive without losing their humanity. Now, his 4-year-old daughter was learning what happened to those who fell outside society's protection. "Thomas Whitmore," Reverend Caldwell's voice carried across the square like a judgment itself. "I trust you remember your duty to your children and to God." The threat was clear. Help the marked woman and face the consequences. Thomas felt the weight of 3 small hands clutching at his coat, trusting him to keep them safe in a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. But Sarah's breathing was growing more labored. Without water, without shelter from the sun, she wouldn't survive the day. Thomas reached for the ropes around her wrists, his deity, cyan crystallizing even as his hands began to shake. The rope fell away from Sarah's wrists with a whisper. Thomas caught her as she slumped forward, her weight surprisingly light in his arms. Behind him, he heard Reverend Caldwell's sharp intake of breath. "What do you think you're doing, Whitmore?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted Sarah carefully, cradling her against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fevered heat of her skin through his shirt. The children pressed closer, Mary's small hand gripping his belt. "Taking her home," Thomas said finally, turning to face the Reverend. Caldwell descended the church steps slowly, his black coat flapping like wings. Several men emerged from nearby buildings, Jacob Morrison from the general store, Pete Hawkins from the saloon, others who formed the backbone of the congregation's authority. "That woman has been judged by God himself," Caldwell's voice rose to carry across the square. "Any man who interferes with divine justice marks himself as her accomplice in sin." "Seems to me God judges in his own time," Thomas replied, adjusting Sarah's weight in his arms. "This is man's work." Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You've got 3 children to think about, Tom. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Thomas felt Emma's fingers dig into his coat. Samuel had gone very still beside him, the way children do when they sense real danger. Little Mary continued to whimper, not understanding why the adults' voices had turned sharp and cold. "My children are exactly what I'm thinking about," Thomas said. He could feel Sarah's shallow breathing against his neck, growing weaker by the moment. "What kind of man do you want them to remember their father was?" "A living one," Hawkins growled, moving to flank Thomas's left side. The square had grown quiet, except for the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings. Thomas counted 6 men arrayed against him, all armed, all convinced they were doing God's work. In his arms, Sarah stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to focus on his face with confused recognition. "Please," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "Don't let them hurt your children." Thomas looked down at her, then at his own 3 little ones clustered around his legs. Emma's face was pale but determined, already understanding more than an 8-year-old should have to. Samuel watched the men with the calculating gaze of a boy learning that the world could turn dangerous without warning. Mary just cried, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. Reverend Caldwell raised his hand, and Thomas saw the other men tense. "Set her down, Whitmore. Walk away with your children, and we'll speak no more of this foolishness." Thomas's grip tightened on Sarah. Her blood was seeping through his shirt now, warm and sticky against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and irregular, fighting to keep going despite everything that had been done to her. "No," he said simply. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Thomas saw hands move toward weapons, saw the Reverend's face harden into something cold and implacable. There would be no walking away now, no pretending this moment hadn't happened. Sarah's fingers found his shirt, gripping weakly. "Run," she breathed. But Thomas's boots stayed planted in the dust, his children pressed against his legs, his arms full of a broken woman who had been cast out for the sin of being unlucky in love. "Papa," Emma's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I'll help you carry her." Thomas looked down at his 8-year-old daughter in amazement. Emma had stepped forward, her small hands reaching towards Sarah's dangling arm. Her face was set with the same stubborn determination that had gotten her in trouble at school more times than Thomas could count. "Emma, no," he started. "She needs help," Emma said firmly. "Mama used to say that's what we do. We help people who need help." Samuel stepped up beside his sister, his 6-year-old frame trembling but resolute. "I'll help too." Even little Mary stopped crying, reaching up to touch Sarah's hand with gentle fingers. "Is she sleeping?" The men surrounding them faltered. Thomas saw uncertainty flicker across Morrison's face, watched Hawkins lower his hand from his gun. It was one thing to threaten a stubborn rancher. It was another entirely to menace children who were trying to show mercy. Reverend Caldwell's voice cracked like a whip. "This is exactly the corruption I warned about. The woman's sin spreads to innocence. The only corruption here," interrupted a new voice, "is grown men threatening children in God's name." Dr. Elizabeth Hayes stepped into the square, her medical bag in one hand, her other hand resting on the small pistol she wore openly on her hip. She was one of the few people in Redemption who could challenge the Reverend's authority and live to tell about it. partly because she was the only trained physician for 50 miles, and partly because she feared nothing on earth or in heaven. "Dr. Hayes," Caldwell's tone grew cautious, "this doesn't concern you?" "A woman bleeding to death in my town concerns me plenty." She moved to Thomas's side, her experienced eyes assessing Sarah's condition. "This woman needs immediate medical attention, or she'll die within the hour." Thomas felt Sarah's breathing grow more shallow. Her grip on his shirt had loosened, her body going limp in his arms. The children pressed closer, sensing the life ebbing away from the broken womb. And their father held. "Please," Emma whispered, looking up at the circle of hard-faced men. "Don't let her die." Dr. Hayes straightened, her gaze sweeping the assembled men with contempt. "Any of you want to explain to these children why you're willing to watch a woman die? Want to tell them that's what good Christian men do?" The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Thomas watched the men exchange glances, saw doubt creeping into their faces. Morrison was the first to step back, then Hawkins. One by one, they began to disperse, muttering excuses and avoiding the children's eyes. Only Reverend Caldwell remained, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Whitmore. The judgment stands. Any man who takes that woman into his home brings damnation on his house." But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The presence of the children had shifted something fundamental in the square's dynamic, reminded everyone watching that mercy and cruelty were choices, not divine mandates. Thomas looked down at Sarah's pale face, then at his 3 children standing guard around him like small sentinels. "Then I guess we'll see what damnation looks like," he said quietly. Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. "My clinic's too small, but your ranch has room. We need to get her there now." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the Whitmore Ranch, her hands steady as she braided Emma's hair for school. The scars on her back had faded to thin white lines, barely visible beneath the simple blue dress Thomas had bought her in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. The church had made good on Reverend Caldwell's threats. The family was shunned from services, their business boycotted by the faithful, but neighboring ranchers, men who valued Thomas's character over the Reverend's judgment, continued to trade with them. Dr. Hayes had spread word to surrounding communities about Sarah's skill with healing herbs and midwifery, knowledge that proved more valuable than the town's approval. Sarah said softly, tying off Emma's braid with a ribbon. "Perfect." Emma turned and hugged her around the waist. It had taken months for the children to stop flinching when Sarah moved too quickly, months for her to learn to speak above a whisper. But gradually, the broken woman Thomas had carried from that dusty square had found her voice again. Thomas appeared in the doorway, Samuel and Mary trailing behind him. "Ready for town?" Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her shawl. They had been making these trips to Cedar Falls for supplies, but she still felt exposed beyond the safety of the ranch. The memory of rope and leather died hard. "Mrs. Sarah," Mary piped up, using the title that had emerged naturally over the past months. "Will you tell us the story about the brave rabbit again tonight?" "Of course, little one." Thomas watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The woman who'd been marked as cursed had proven to be exactly what his children needed. Not a replacement for their mother, but someone who understood loss, who could show them that survival was possible, even after the world tried to break you. They'd married 3 weeks ago in a simple ceremony at Dr. Hayes's clinic, with only the children and the doctor as witnesses. Not for love, that was still growing slowly between them like something fragile and new, but for protection. As Thomas's wife, Sarah gained the shield of his name and reputation. As Sarah's husband, Thomas gained a partner who understood that family was built from choice as much as blood. As they walked toward the wagon, Sarah caught Thomas's arm gently. "The Reverend's been asking questions in town again." Thomas nodded. Caldwell hadn't forgiven their defiance, but his influence had waned as word spread of what had really happened in that square. People had begun to ask uncomfortable questions about a church that would beat a woman nearly to death for the crime of grief. "Let him ask," Thomas said. "We've got nothing to hide." Sarah looked out over the ranch, at the children playing in the yard, at the vegetable garden she'd planted behind the house, at the life that had grown from the ashes of everything she'd lost. The future stretched uncertain before them, full of challenges and small joys, marked by the kind of quiet courage that builds families from strangers and homes from hope. The sun climbed higher over the Montana plains, casting long shadows behind them as they rode toward town. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily against the endless sky, and Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. Behind them, the ranch stood solid and welcoming, a place where the marked and the broken could find shelter, and where 3 children had learned that the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away.